Now, Sean Hagedorn, an independent strategy advisor, recently wrote an article entitled, "Is South Africa Slipping into a Poverty Trap?" He asks if this is the case, who would be the first to know and who would sound the alarm? And he says perhaps in an ideal world, credit agencies and capital market participants would be quick to alert the rest of us. However, maybe this isn't quite happening. He joins us now from our Cape Town studios. Sean, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Let's begin with your argument. You are saying that South Africa is slipping into a poverty trap. Please explain.
Well, most I'm raising the question, is it? And then if it was, how would we know?
Yeah.
And some of the first points to make is that South Africa's economy is very unusual, and the transformation and growth model strategies are severe. The challenges are really immense, and they need to be balanced. And if they're not balanced, what would happen in a lot of other economies is it would lead to a banking crisis.
Right.
In South Africa, and strategists often say your strengths are your weaknesses. In South Africa, the banks are quite strong. They have very strong credit cultures, and they can manage a lot of credit risk. So instead of having a banking crisis, what would happen, and I think what the real risk is, that if the policies aren't leading to South Africa becoming more competitive and creating more purchasing power at the end of the day, instead of a banking crisis, what you'll have is a poverty trap, which is much worse.
Okay. Let's take a step back and define that poverty trap. What would it entail? What is it?
Well, a simple way of looking at it, and it's not as if economists have a real cut and dry definition. There's variations on the theme, but a simple way of saying is people want to have purchasing power.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are starting to wonder, is that happening now in South Africa? And we could go back over the last 10 years, 20, 30, 40, go back as far as you want, and we could work out why we've now arrived at a juncture where this is a real risk.
Absolutely. The interesting point, though, that some people would make is that we are also looking, I mean, you're taking the point here with the fall of ABEL, let's put it that way, African Bank, with the fall of ABEL is pointing perhaps to a juncture that we could point at in the future and say this is when it happened. But people could also mention the fact that we had Sambu that also ran into problems, and the central bank stepped in and it was saved. Could potentially people not argue the same that is happening here, that we are going to get into calmer waters with the intervention that we've seen coming out of the central bank, and therefore is not the inflection point that you are making it to be? Okay.
Well, we are where we are now. So, you know, maybe there's a comparison to be made to 10 years ago or so. I would say not. I would say if you look at the high growth period in South Africa from 2003 to 2007, you had numbers of 5–6% annual growth rate. And you would, if let's say it's South Africa, you look at South Korea, a country like that, where almost all of its growth comes from exporting finished goods to wealthy consumers in other parts of the world, then you don't run the risk of a poverty trap. Because, and that's really the rise of Asia, and this is how Africa and South Africa are vastly different. There isn't that exporting to a part of the world which has massive discretionary income. The way the South African economy is set is it's focused on growth through its own consumers. So what happened between 2003 and 2007, you had high growth, but a lot of that was on the back of strong commodity prices and really huge increases of debt. And then you had further waves of debt increases after that. So at some point, you just run out of purchasing power. It really is like that.
Okay. Now, if we look at the current system, in part, the point you raise is suggesting that the market system is failing because it's not recognizing the potential poverty trap that is happening or about to begin. Would that be the case? And what would be required to try and make sure that we recognize this point for what it is and take measures to ensure we don't get into a poverty trap?
Right, and Godfrey, I think you're kind of pushing a hot button for me there, because distinguishing between market signals and market failures is very important, and so that would bring in the whole issue of did SARB respond to what really was market signals that there is something like a poverty trap going on, and they saw that as market failure. I very much see it as market signals which have been misinterpreted, that lending generally can be a good thing, but it's kind of like drugs. Some drugs are good, some drugs aren't good. But even the good drugs, if you take them in excess, they become toxic.
Yeah.
And I think that we've had clear market signals and not a market failure, that the market signals should have been listened to.
Yeah. You're suggesting as well that there are lessons for us to be learned here from the Americans and what happened with the subprime crisis.
Right. And I mean, really big picture is the rise of Asia. I mean, that's the story that's going on now. That, 60% of the people in the world are Asian, and they've made tremendous progress. And it's just a much more competitive world we live in, and economies have to adjust to that. Now, just coming back, and I think the U.S. did. I think the U.S. in the end of the day benefited from the Lehman crisis because a lot of the really difficult decisions were made.
Right.
What's really bad about a poverty crisis is it's not like a banking crisis. You don't really have the exciting events that people suddenly get in a room and they make tough decisions.
Yeah.
A poverty crisis really leads to a lot of populist policies, which then leads to lower and lower competitiveness and more poverty, which is very scary.
Yeah. So in part, if we go back to the argument about the market signals, and perhaps you're saying it's not a market failure, it's market signals that have been misinterpreted here. Were there other options available to the sub in which it could have reacted, or for other policymakers?
Well, they have a lot more information than I do, and then other information is going to come out. I think probably the big picture is that African Bank was different, that their credit model proved to be deficient. It worked for a long time.
Yeah.
And of course, then this would support my central thesis. Their credit model worked for a long time, but if we are entering a poverty trap because we're just running out of purchasing power, because really what's happening is you're not aligning the objectives of transformation with a growth model, which involves competitiveness, then that would be, again, we come back to the market signal is that African Bank failed because you're basically running out of purchasing power. And what is interesting there is a bit of a looping effect.
Yeah.
They would point to the strikes. Well, then really what we should do is we should look and say, what really motivated the strikes?
Yeah.
Did excess lending play a role? And people are starting to ask that question, those sorts of questions, which is encouraging.
Yeah. Sean, one of these days you and I need to sit down and have another conversation around how Africa has responded to the rise of the East, and also at the same time we're seeing the West responding. And you are also making the point about how South Africa is responding to the whole mix that we're seeing. One day we'll need to come back to that conversation. But for now, I want us to go back to the issue of what leadership ought to do now with the situation that we have now, to ensure that we don't, if there is a poverty trap, that we actually get out of it, or we take steps to make sure that we don't get into it. Right.
Well, I mean, compared to a banking crisis, and again, the relatively recent U.S. Banking crisis, people really did step back and they took a hard look at what was going on. The thing about banking crisis, it makes you focus your mind, and there's a lot of companies who were quickly at risk of going under, and the credit mechanisms basically ground to a halt. So that encouraged rapid decision making.
Yeah.
It's more of a big picture.
Sean, are you saying, Sean, are you saying that we need a crisis in order to fix the mess that we have now?
More or less. It'd be great to do it without a crisis, but look, the transformation objectives and the growth model objectives. And by the way, India is a good example here.
Yeah.
I mean, the two of the top economists in the world are having like a vicious fight, and these are old, really polite people. One's a Nobel Prize winner, all this, and it's between, can you really focus on redistribution, or do you have to focus on growth?
Yeah.
And South Africa needs to have that dialogue. And look, and then the other thing where you have a problem in South Africa is that the capital markets really dominate the conversation.
Yeah.
And there are massive disconnects between what's going on the ground, and that really does come out from the able discussion now that you're seeing happen, is that, from a capital markets perspective, you can say, well, look, unsecured lending is only 10 or 12% of the total bank lending, so it's not a problem. From an economic development perspective, however, it goes to the core of people moving from abject poverty to lower middle class, and that's who the money lenders feed on, and the unsecured lenders feed on.
Yeah.
And if you do that excessively, maybe it's only 10 or 12%, but in effect, it's feeding on your young.
Yeah.
Feeding on your young may only be 10 or 12%, but it's the long-term prospects or implications are very harsh.
Yeah. Sean, I've just been told we've got a minute. In that minute, can I ask you, are you saying South Africa's leadership is focused more on redistribution than actually trying to grow the cake?
No, you have to blend the two together. You need redistribution. I think really what I'm saying basically is it's not working.
Yeah.
Now the evidence is accumulating. If you look at the capital markets indicators or the credit analysts or even the banks, they're going to be last to feel. It's going to be the consumer, and people should listen more to the consumers, and they're really having a tough time now.
Absolutely. Sean Hagedorn, Independent Strategy Advisor, thank you for your time.